got Ms. Daisy Nielsen here. She's by far the youngest of all the presenters, but possibly the most intelligent. We'll see. And I'm quite serious. She's got a bachelor's in international relations and politics and a master's in sustainable development, and she's currently doing her PhD in geography at UNAM. And she's been working with us on assessing, analyzing, keeping track of carbon, biodiversity, credits and markets, and what's happening. So she's got a presentation for us just on really latest, what happened this morning still.
Thank you, Everett, for the introduction, and hello everyone. Very nice to be here with you. Hello to the online attendees as well. Firstly, I wonder how to expand this. Okay. Before I start, I'd just like to thank the previous speakers for their very insightful presentations on their research. I'm going to change it up slightly and not talk about any research-related things per se, but more broadly around the carbon and biodiversity opportunities that are emerging here in Namibia and more broadly around Africa. So, carbon and biodiversity market opportunity is a case for Namibia. It's a case for climate mitigation and adaptation, but also provides a solution to one of the big challenges we have around what we're discussing here today, financing large-scale restoration. So to give a brief overview of what I'll be talking about in the presentation, I'll try to keep it quick. I'm going to provide an explanation on what carbon and biodiversity markets are. Some of you might know them, some of you might not. There's a real buzzword around carbon and sustainability, so I'm sure you all have heard about them at some stage. And then I'm going to focus on carbon and biodiversity opportunities specific to Namibia, what's occurring, what's been going on over the past few months, and what projects are going on. Then I'm going to reflect on some key challenges and considerations that we face around carbon and biodiversity markets, and offer some reflections and solutions to those issues. I'm also going to briefly give an introduction to our own carbon market model, which we've been working on over the past few months, and which is progressing really well. And then finally offer some conclusions to wrap things up. So to provide some broad context, humanity as a whole has tended to underappreciate ecosystem services in the past few decades. We've tended to overexploit natural resources. Deforestation has been a huge issue. Poor land management practices have taken over, and in consequence, we're facing a climate disaster. Climate change is impacting everyone across the world, so we need to think about a new way of restoring land and thinking about ecosystem services in a new light. So the sector has identified carbon as a unit of measuring our impact. We think about carbon in almost everything we do now around climate change. It's become a unit that is referred to, impact our carbon footprints, how many emissions are companies releasing, etc. And we've now decided that carbon should come at a price. Those corporations, organizations that are emitting a lot into the atmosphere, current atmospheric levels are at 420 parts per million. We need to change our mindset around carbon, and so we've placed a price on it for sequestering it down into the carbon sinks, terrestrial or aquatic systems for permanent storage. There's also a new realm developing around biodiversity and the importance of biodiversity beyond carbon. So biodiversity has been identified as a new area of ecosystem services that are growing a lot in their attention. And international frameworks have come around in the last few years alongside new standards that have regulated carbon markets and biodiversity markets. I've just put up an image here to show you the increase of carbon emissions, as I'm sure you're all aware of, and the importance to sequester these emissions back down. We're facing this legacy load of 420 parts per million, and a real need to sequester as much as possible, as quickly as possible. And the carbon markets offer that opportunity to finance these activities. So carbon markets are systems where carbon emission reductions are traded as carbon credits. This provides an economic incentive to improve the carbon stocks that are sequestered long term. There are two different types of markets currently existing. We have compliance markets, which are regulated by government policies and international agreements. These come back to the Paris Agreement of 2015, where countries signed up to state that they were going to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions, and in turn offer a trading system where countries can trade internationally traded mitigation outcomes. The other market is called the voluntary market, which I think most of you are probably more aware of. This allows businesses, organizations, and individuals to voluntarily offset their emissions. And people, organizations, corporations are all doing this for their contributions to net zero, for corporate social responsibility purposes, and also to tackle the issue of climate change more broadly. So both markets nonetheless play a significant role in reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And various standards have come into play recently to encourage carbon sequestering activity. Just for reference, 1 credit is the equivalent of 1 ton of carbon dioxide sequestered, or equivalent. So here's a quick model, a very simplified model of how carbon credits are traded between an activity and the carbon emitter. Someone like Shell might release a lot of emissions and so offset their emissions using perhaps a reforestation project to compensate for those emissions that they've released. Biodiversity markets are a fairly new phenomenon in recent months, actually. And they're coming out, they're developing as they're taking some of the lessons from carbon markets. As I'll get into later, carbon markets have faced quite a bit of scrutiny. So the biodiversity markets are coming out trying to take those lessons on board and try to improve the market system. Anyways, biodiversity markets are essentially a payment, similar to carbon markets, for the protection, restoration, or management of biodiversity. And more broadly, they're referred to biodiversity net gains, in which a land area, for example, improves its biodiversity richness or species diversity over a period of time, and this can be monitored and tracked. And companies are looking to purchase biodiversity credits for their their nature positive claims. So compliance-driven mitigation markets are more developed than voluntary markets. They are dependent on domestic regulations. In Australia, for example, there's a strict kind of nature framework that encourages companies really to think through their biodiversity contributions. The voluntary carbon markets are emerging very slowly, but as they're thinking more deeply about the issues of the carbon markets, this is why it's taken a while to release methodologies. The first methodology is Plan Vivo, and it was released last December in 2023. There's 5 pillars that this methodology in particular looks at in calculating a biodiversity credit. They look at species richness, species diversity, taxonomic dissimilarity, species habitat, and the spatial habitat. Sorry, I can't remember the last one. And another carbon standard, a nature standard, Vera, are going to release their methodology later this year. There's an image here to kind of visualize what I'm referring to as being nature positive. Anyways, moving on, some carbon market opportunities in Namibia. So all of these projects listed here on this slide indicate either an avoidance in carbon emissions or a sequestration of carbon emissions. The first one is renewable energy, which would be the avoidance of greenhouse gas emissions. We know green hydrogen is coming up very rapidly in Namibia. There's also reforestation, afforestation and revegetation projects going on, agricultural transitions from bad practices to more agroecological practices, sequestering that carbon long term. Ocean-based solutions, for example, kelp forests. Oceans are a huge carbon sink, and so some companies are looking at kelp as a solution to sequester large amounts of carbon and store it. We also have RED+, which means reduced emissions for deforestation and degradation in dryland forests, clean cook stoves, which is also an example of emission avoidance. And more relevant to today's discussion is around bush control and how Professor Ben Strohbach mentioned earlier, how bush control can have an impact on carbon sequestration, soil health, and carbon permanence. So I've provided a case study around bush encroachment here in Namibia. We know bush encroachment poses huge issues on the environment. It depletes soil microbial activity, has a reduction in biodiversity, and is detrimental to the carrying capacity and farm productivity. So we can use carbon markets to unlock the financing for improving ecosystem services around bush encroachment. And the bush can therefore be utilized as a valuable opportunity for restoring environments if managed properly, as the previous presentations have stressed. They can have impact on soil organic carbon. Biochar can be produced out of the bush, which locks away carbon for a very, very long time, encourages revegetation of perennial and annual grasses, and has significant returns on biodiversity. Moving on to some opportunities in Namibia around biodiversity, I'll quickly cover these. They're not so advanced in Namibia for the reasons I discussed, but there are two different types of projects that biodiversity credits are looking at. Restorative projects, which focus on depleted area and restoring those areas, encouraging the return of species, vegetation, soil microorganisms. And there's also conservation projects, maintaining the biodiversity of a specific area long term and proving that you're doing that. I'd like to note that it is difficult at this stage to layer on biodiversity credits and carbon credits because of the complexities around financing, or when the buyers buy a specific credit, they're paying for that service rather than two combined. But I've given some examples here around what some carbon and biodiversity projects can do. One is stacking, in which you add multiple certified credits on top of one another, and these are usually from the same standard and methodology. You can also have a bundling package, which offers credits from different land boundaries under one project umbrella. And one that is one called Carbon Plus, which offers a holistic carbon project looking at carbon sequestration particularly for and transferring credits through carbon sequestration, but adding on biodiversity uplifts. So that's the plus, or part of the plus in Carbon Plus. I've left a note here to say that the market is still very much developing and the prices around biodiversity credits do fluctuate. And there's also an issue in which the buyers still need to be discovered, who's going to be the main purchasers of biodiversity credits. It's still evolving. Within the case of Namibia, there's various regulatory frameworks at play that one might need to consider if you're considering carbon or biodiversity projects. The Ministry of Environment have policies in place which set targets for greenhouse gas emission reductions and implements strategy, or they encourage strategies around agriculture, specifically forestry and energy sectors. There's also the Environmental Management Act that requires environmental impact assessments and biodiversity conservation. And more recently, Namibia released their national framework on international carbon markets. They've stated that their national determined contribution to the Paris Agreement is to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions by 91%. This falls under the compliance market rather than the voluntary market. So, yeah, there's also other international standards for voluntary markets that are important to consider. Different methodologies exist out there under different standards for diverse carbon sequestering activities. The carbon markets are also regulated and guided by the Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Market and the Science-Based Targets Initiative. So a few challenges and considerations to think about around carbon and biodiversity projects is issues specifically around transparency and accountability. Carbon markets in particular have faced a lot of scrutiny over the past decades and past few years because of issues around double counting. Some projects haven't properly tracked their carbon sequestration to be truly a realistic projection. They've overstated their carbon impact. There's a lot of greenwashing going on in the corporate world where some companies might be claiming that they're doing more than they actually are. So science is increasingly important in the carbon and biodiversity world. There's also financial limitations. Setting up a carbon and biodiversity project is hugely expensive, not least around the the standards that exist and verifying your project against those, but also the initial investment cost to get the activities underway and continue robust monitoring processes over time. There's a lot of digital approaches out there that can be used to track carbon sequestration and biodiversity uplift, but these are of course very expensive. There's also social issues where some carbon project developers aren't considering the impacts made on the communities that are around carbon project areas. So there's a real need for community engagement and benefit sharing. And there's some environmental challenges that are at play, proving additionality is in effect and permanence is secured long term. So some of the solutions I mentioned before include robust data collection and monitoring plans. I can't stress this importance enough. Everything has to be validated and proven transparently for the buyer to have full confidence in purchasing carbon credits. Also, innovative financing solutions are coming out now where some corporations are looking at pre-financing plans for carbon projects, buying a certain number of credits in advance and allowing the activity to sequester the carbon. There's also green bonds that can be issued, strategies around community engagement and trust building for the issues that are around community engagement, and also the scientific-based approaches to carbon sequestration. Most of the methodologies are based on stringent scientific foundations, but many are still emerging, so it's important really to have a scientific grounding for any carbon or biodiversity project. I'd like to briefly talk about some work that we've been doing at PRI around our carbon project. You'll hear about it a bit more later, but we've identified a carbon standard called Carbon Standards International, and they are renowned for biochar in particular, and they regulate the biochar space, and we're looking at carbon credits through the production of biochar, in which PRI will become a C-Sync manager under this Carbon Standard International standard, and the farmers we're working with will become what they're called artisan pros. Biochar credits are created from Kentucky kilns, and we plan to partner with farmers across the country to tackle the issue of bush encroachment using biochar as a solution. We're also very, very strongly linked to this idea of carbon plus, having multiple co-benefits to carbon projects. We are issuing a training model which is grounded on being farmer-centric, science-based, and not-for-profit. I've discussed this earlier. But we're looking on layering numerous co-benefits, including the biodiversity returns. We hope to track long-term biodiversity returns. Social uplift, we're looking at layering multiple modules for bush harvesters, community members to undertake, such as family planning, financial literacy, sanitation, health, the list goes on and on, around what can be done to support social uplift. And of course, economic value added to the farmer. It provides an opportunity to diversify their activities on the farm and also mitigate climate change and do their part to restore their farm in a scientific manner. We also promote transparency so that there's a clear, everything's done transparently between the farmer, the manager, the buyer, and the public, who eventually, the buyer's public relations, so that they're able to go back and see the impact that they've made through buying the credits. Lastly, just to conclude, why does this all matter for the farmers and for public thinking about carbon markets and biodiversity markets? There's a big transfer of wealth that comes from carbon markets and biodiversity markets, from the rich, polluting countries to the more developing countries. It provides an opportunity to finance the large-scale restorative activities that need to take place to build climate resilience and adaptation to future climate shocks. Carbon markets also, on the methodology front, offer a scientific-based solution to restoring degraded land in a measurable way. And lastly, it diversifies economic activities on the farm. I think that's it. Thank you very much.
Well done, Daisy. That was really well done. Your English language is much better than mine. Questions for Daisy, please. Online. There's online questions.
Yes, we have a question from Stefan Glazer. What is the status of making biochar available to crop farmers?
Someone else will be having to answer that question. Making biochar available to crop farmers. We are not really involved in that spectrum. Michael, do you have a better understanding?
There are projects, for example, Saki Kafula is one of the guys making it available to huge projects in the Caprivi area there. Then from K-On, the Charcoal Association, we have individual farmers producing biochar already, which you can buy in the Kunene region and around Otavi. So there are farmers that have started. But as long as farmers are not getting money for biochar, the selling price needs to be established. We need to create value for it, because the carbon credit is not really working yet for the farmers. You will see the gain in the biochar production. But farmers are really positioning, especially from our member side, for a huge biochar, production capacity. It's happening. We've also got a company, Green Charcoal. They are affiliated with Carbobois in Belgium, who are exporting for samples for testing in Europe as well. Then we also have Pyronam, who are in Kalkveld, who are producing large-scale biochar, which is passed all the certificates for feed grade, not food grade, feed grade specifically, and they also sell the biochar already, and also with it carbon credits. So the program has started in Namibia. It's just the uptake. Farmers are always reluctant. If I don't see it works for my neighbor, I'm not going to do it. So it's that attitude currently that we have, but it's really it's on the uptake at the moment.
Thank you.